pretty much my big master list of cult comedy films that I like, enough to own on DVD. This is by no means an extensive list of all of the best cult comedy films you can watch. And I'm sure I have my viewers that are questioning the fact that I like comedy films and that I don't just get all of my amusement from horror films, considering how much I talk about them. Anyway, so this list is going to be long, so I'll get into it. So the first one would be Arsenic and Old Lace with Cary Grant. While this was considered one of his most amusing, impressive, and silly roles, he himself hated the film, which is definitely a shame because it's very, very funny. It's from the 40s, and it's the oldest one on this list. If you haven't seen it, this is definitely a classic and well worth the watch. It's very campy and very entertaining. Now, an absolute favorite that I saw as a teenager and have gotten endless amounts of amusement from ever since, especially considering how quotable, outrageous, and meta it is Mel Brooks' Blazing Saddles with Gene Wilder. If you haven't seen this film, you are seriously, seriously missing out because I have a major Mel Brooks obsession, and his stuff is all really, really funny, and this is the best Western spoof I've seen. And I'm so pleased that it happened. And it was very, very dangerous in 1974 and kind of a risky thing to do. And it pulled out just fine, and I love it. Another one which is slightly less funny, but still I'd call it a comedy, is Harold and Maude with Ruth Gordon and Bud Cort. It ended up getting Bud Cort typecast like crazy as the crazy kid for the remainder of his career, and Ruth Gordon was definitely a force to be reckoned with in this and other things too. Bud Cort's character Harold has this major obsession with death, and it makes for some very intriguing on-screen fake suicide attempts that I thought were absolutely hilarious, even if the ending itself was not terribly funny. It is incredibly 70s, like super crazy dated, but definitely worth a watch if you haven't seen it yet. Speaking of Mel Brooks, as I've already mentioned him, who likes horror films at all, hasn't seen Young Frankenstein by this point. If you haven't, please do. This movie is ridiculously quotable. I can probably quote the entire film word for word from beginning to end, which is very ridiculous because high school me had some friends that discovered this film, and we all just sort of joined the bandwagon and decided this was the best thing that ever existed. And again, with the love for Gene Wilder and my immense amount of love for, well, pretty much everybody in this film, and how unbelievably clever it is. Now, this one is also not exactly comedy, but it's certainly very funny and has gotten major cult standing, which would be the Rocky Horror Picture Show. For anyone who is in the alternative subcultures or in any kind of fringe culture, this film is what I'd call a must-watch because it speaks to the misfit and the freak and everybody, and it's just great. It isn't everybody's cup of tea necessarily, but it's definitely worth every single person I can think of watching at least once, even if they don't go all crazy and go to Shadowcast like I do. This one is also not totally for everyone because it's really weird and it's really bad, but I really liked it because I love the Ramones, and that's Rock and Roll High School. This movie is ridiculous from beginning to end, and if there's one thing I love, it's Roger Corman's belief in young directors, even if he's like, yeah, here's 10 grand, now go and make a movie, you have 6 weeks, which is like the longest timetable, and he's like, oh yeah, you have 6 weeks until it's released in theaters. But I appreciated that he would take a chance on young directors and be like, I don't know if your movie's trash or not. I don't care. You have spark. You have spunk. Go for it. Here's some actors. Bye. Go and make that movie. And so you ended up with the Ramones in this piece of trash cinema that I adore. Next up, and a very unusual choice considering the type of person I am, and I'm not sure why I like this movie as much as I do, which is Fast Times at Ridgemont High. My mom and I have this movie in common for enjoyment, and I'm not really sure, but there's something about the quintessential day in the life of a high schooler comedy that I just find immensely appealing. It's almost like some kind of weird sociological study for me. I don't really know why, but I find it really immensely entertaining. And this movie is very offbeat and has these funny moments in it that just completely catch you off guard, even if the rest of it's kind of slow. Now, this movie I've definitely found unbelievably hilarious, despite the fact that the first time I watched it, my friend said, yeah, it's only funny the first time, it's not funny the second time. I I disagree with that statement because I have found this movie hilarious every single time I've watched it. It's a mockumentary on a fake metal band, Spinal Tap. If you haven't seen this, Rob Reiner did a great job, and it's just hilarious, and it does spoof several crazy things that have happened in actual rock and roll bands in the 70s and early 80s. Like, such as getting lost behind stage, being inside of, like, coming up on stage inside of a pod and it not being able to open. Such crazy things like that were taken from actual experiences of other musicians. It's really funny. You can always just turn it up to 11. This is a little bit of an odd one as well, that it seems that I wouldn't like such a thing, but Pee-wee's Big Adventure, Tim Burton's first movie, is all kinds of weird and totally worth the watch. There's some crazy cameos in here. It's very entertaining, very ridiculous. When I'm wearing my big platform boots, I'm able to do the Pee Wee Herman dance. And I don't know what I find so funny about this movie. It might have had to do with the fact that I saw it in a theater with an audience of people who grew up with it. I don't really know what it is, but I find it endlessly entertaining every single time I watch it. The next one, which is supremely underrated, I've probably mentioned before, is Clue with Tim Curry, and oh my goodness, I find this movie exceedingly funny every single time I see it. There are so many just witticisms in it that it's ridiculous. And it's the most successful movie I can think of that's based off of a board game, in my experience. It's very, very entertaining, and it's definitely a fun twist on the classic Murder House mystery game. I love it. It's fantastic. Please watch it if you haven't. Watch it with any one of the 3 endings, or watch it with all 3 of the endings. Another one, which I don't think anybody can grow up without watching at least once, which would be Ferris Bueller's Day Off. I don't know if I've mentioned it, and it's kind of a weird thing, but I have this weird obsession with John Hughes films, including this, and Pretty in Pink being my favorite, and The Breakfast Club, and 16 Candles, and Weird Science. I don't know why, but I love them all very much, and this is definitely the first one I saw out of the lot. I grew up with this film. I think a great number of other people did as well, and it's just pure classic comedy gold in many respects. This one, which is overlooked a little bit, but definitely has its own cult standing, and I'm sure a good number of people kind of remember it as a fond childhood memory, and involves one of the best on-screen portrayals of Dracula. I've mentioned it in a couple of other videos, which would be Monster Squad from 1984. This is definitely a lot of fun. I really wish I'd seen it when I was younger. I didn't see it for the first time until like 6 months ago, or a year ago, something like that. Way too recent. I totally should have grown up with this, because it would have made me a more well-balanced individual. It's very, very entertaining. Another one that I have mentioned countless times and will always, always advocate for 10,000 more years or something, which would be Heathers with Winona Ryder and Christian Slater. And this is one of the most clever, most pop culturally relevant and witty things I've ever seen. And it's kind of funny because, like most of my favorite films, when I first watched it, I didn't like it. But then when I watched it a second time, I decided, what was I thinking? This movie is absolutely brilliant. And I suggest it to everyone I know, especially for anybody in my generation who has a fixation on Mean Girls, which has apparently become the millennials' joke film or something. This film is really, really great, and you kind of have to see it. Other films that you probably have heard and have grown up with would include The Princess Bride, because who hasn't seen this? Because if you haven't, I'm sorry, and please amend that. Again, with Rob Reiner, the guy who did This Is Spinal Tap. This movie is ridiculously funny, and I unfortunately haven't gotten the chance to read the book yet, although I do want to. In fact, for a very long time, I didn't even know there was a book until I'd seen this movie like 4 times, and now 30 times later, I'm like, why don't I have the book? Why haven't I read it yet? So this is definitely great. Great cast, great witticisms. It's so much fun. And it's totally classic 80s fantasy, and I have a major weakness for that, and have mentioned it in other videos because of it. One I didn't see until much more recently, which, considering my weird fascination with ridiculous high school comedies from the 80s, is Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, and its sequel, Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey, both of which I ended up liking. I didn't see either one of them until August of last year, so way too recently, and I really wish I'd seen them sooner because I was unbelievably entertained. It helped that I saw the first one in a theater. I really love the theater that's not that far from me that does late night showings. Bless. Another one, I have a major, major weakness for John Waters. I don't know why. He is such a skeezy, strange little man, and I love his movies. Crybaby was another one of those movies. First time I watched it, I was like, what the fuck? And then I watched it again. I'm like, no, this is amazing. And also, little, tiny, pretty, angular-faced Johnny Depp in Greaser outfit is a good, good thing. Plus, I have so much love for Iggy Pop and Tracy Lords. So this movie is gold. I definitely suggest it. Another one of his films that I didn't mention because I don't have it on DVD because it's both very funny and very weirdly horrifying is Pink Flamingos, which is one of the ultimate cult films. And if you haven't seen that, oh, have fun. So this one, most people probably haven't heard of, but it's definitely a really weird cult film, which would be Frankenhooker. I found this movie kind of by accident and then decided to try watching it only because of the name, because that name is just gold. And it turned out this movie is wonderful, wonderful campy trash. And I was so pleased. And I was kind of impressed with it, and then it was the ending that just was that extra nudge into me laughing so hard I fell off the couch. This is ridiculous. There are exploding hookers at one point. Everything about this is preposterous, but it's also very, very entertaining. Not terribly PC, but very entertaining. Another one I really should have seen way, way earlier and had been meaning to see since I was a young teenager and didn't see till I was like 21, is Wayne's World. And this movie is ridiculously funny, and it's exactly the type of weird, off-kilter indie humor that I adore, and also their reaction to meeting Alice Cooper is probably the reaction I would have if I met Alice Cooper, which is to just start bowing and say that I wasn't worthy. And also I have a weird kinship with Garth, and it's very entertaining. I haven't had a chance to see the second one. My mom says that it is okay because she had been pitching this movie to me for a long time, but I'd never found a copy of it until it showed up on Netflix not that long ago. So yay. Another weird movie that I didn't think my mom would like and she introduced me to is the Buffy the Vampire Slayer movie. I've mentioned it a few times in other videos, in random lectures, and blah blah blah. I have a major obsession with the TV show and can give you a 16-hour long lecture on the ins and outs of why I love it and hate it so much. But if you consider it a separate entity, I also really love the film and that there's a lot of one-liners and weirdness in it that I find endlessly entertaining. Not sure why. It's fun. To go with my off-kilter humor obsession, this was my introduction to Kevin Smith and the View Askew universe with Jay and Silent Bob and Red Hook, New Jersey, and superhero obsessions and all that fun stuff. I appreciate that this movie was very inflammatory and blasphemous when it was first released, and I respect that immensely, and I also just thought it was insanely, ridiculously funny. And I appreciate that it caused a lot of problems for all the people who acted in it when it came to their professional careers. And I find that fascinating, because I didn't find it that blasphemous as someone who was raised by an atheist parent. This is very funny, and I do suggest watching it, especially if you are bitter towards religion, I guess. Another one, for anyone who likes the Coen brothers, they're the ones who did Oh Brother, Where Art Thou and Fargo and Burn After Reading and No Country for Old Men as well, all of which are great, as well as recently Hail Caesar. The Big Lebowski is definitely a classic. It's so strange and off-kilter, and the plot is so peculiar, but it somehow just really, really works. And that rug really tied the room together. And it'll probably make you want to drink White Russians. Again, that's a total dude bro movie, and it's really strange that I'd like it. And I totally do, because it's great. So I've already mentioned Heathers. And if you like Heathers, I highly suggest watching Jawbreaker, another very bizarre, underrated teen film that has a very vicious streak in it that works really, really well, with a very odd Marilyn Manson cameo from when he was still dating the lead actress, Rose McGowan. And then you also have Pam Grier as a detective, and she's just really, really cool. And everything about this is just so strange. And I really wish that more people would see it, because it's that type of late 90s, early 2000s off-kilter dark humor. And it's great. That was another movie. First time I watched it, not terribly impressed. Then I developed a little bit of a girl crush on Rose McGowan because she's strangely beautiful. I don't know. I love it. Because I've already mentioned Kevin Smith, Mallrats was another favorite, in addition to others that are classic, like Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, Clerks, Clerks 2, and Chasing Amy. Mallrats was another one that I found ridiculously funny, and the whole long conversation that Jason Lee has with Stan Lee is just very, very funny and odd. And this movie's just kind of a mess, and I love it. Another one that was kind of a thing that everybody in my high school had a weird obsession with, and I didn't see until like well after everyone else, was 10 Things I Hate About You, based off of William Shakespeare's Taming of the Shrew, with a very tiny Heath Ledger. And I found this movie ridiculously funny, and in that sheer amount of snarkiness. Of course, this one is one that doesn't fit in with the rest exactly, but I totally would love because I'm a giant fan of Oscar Wilde, hence him being tattooed on my bicep, which is The Importance of Being Earnest. I haven't seen the version from the 50s, but I know it is exactly the same as this one because they're both based off of the same play. And if you like witticisms circa the 1890s, it's just ridiculously funny. Since I've already mentioned John Waters once, this was a movie I found more recently on Netflix, which is Cecil B. Demented. This movie is very weird and off-kilter and has to do with independent filmmaking, and I was very, very entertained by it in some perverse way. I don't know, there's nothing really like it, and I highly suggest it if you've never heard of it, never seen it. The title came kind of from a weird comment that a reviewer had made about John Waters. Instead of being Cecil B. DeMille, named him Cecil B. Demented as a strange joke, and he thought it was so weirdly flattering he decided to use it as a movie title. Now, you can't mention cult comedies without mentioning Shaun of the Dead, one of the best horror comedies. Well, it's actually a comedy with horror elements in it. And thank you, Great Britain, for both of the sequels in this loose trilogy that include Hot Fuzz and The World's End. Also, I love both of those, but this is just classic. And again, there's nothing quite like it, and there are definitely plenty of movies that have tried but not quite succeeded, and I'd say this is the most successful of comedies with violence of this degree. Others I'd say would be good examples would include Fido and Tucker and Dale versus Evil, which I didn't bring over. And the last one on here, which is another thing that my generation has gotten very fixated on because the humor is specifically relevant to millennials in a lot of respects, which would be Scott Pilgrim versus the World. There's a lot of jokes in this movie that I still use in everyday dialogue as a running joke. I don't know. I find it very, very entertaining because I think plenty of people can find it entertaining. Plus, it came out when I was 17, and now I'm about the age of most of the main characters, so it's still very funny. So if you ever want ideas on how to get cult films, I found this book at Barnes & Noble, 500 Essential Cult Movies, The Ultimate Guide, which helped me kind of assemble this list a little bit, including some of my own just personal favorites. This book is definitely in-depth, comprehensive. You will probably be seeing more lists that include things out of this book in the future. Just warning you. Anyway, now that that's run nice and long, till next time, Darklings.